Thank you and good evening. So, little brown jobbers, LBJ, is a common collective name for this group of birds that I've been studying for the last 10 years of my career. It's a name that's not exactly a positive term of endearment. It's meant to describe a bunch of birds that people have a hard time of telling apart, species, let alone individuals within those species. A number of years ago, some researchers took some finches and some chickadees and zebra finches in a captive environment and exposed them to prolonged amounts of stress. Pain-free, non-life-threatening stress, constant exposure, day after day, and measured their stress hormone response and measured changes in their plumage over time. Now, over time, birds that were exposed to more stress and had higher levels of stress hormones, plumage began to degrade faster and their plumage was duller. And physically, the structure of barbules, those are little hooks that hold feathers together, began to break down. And the feathers themselves physically began to break down in response to that stress. Our speaker tonight is someone who has thought a lot about how stressful situations and our environment can physically impact our health. My name is Jason Hill. I'm a quantitative ecologist at the Vermont Center for Eco Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Suds and Science here. I am your host for the next 4 months. This series goes in through May, and then we start back in November. If you don't know us, we are a local nonprofit organization, Vermont Center for Eco Studies. We are right down that road and down that road. We are a science-based conservation organization that does a lot of original research. Ornithologists and other folks from amphibians to all kinds of things. If you're interested in citizen science projects, we are a great place to start. I recognize a lot of folks, and just after the end of the last year, thank you for all those who supported our organization last year. It means a lot. It is my distinct pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker, Zane Thayer. Dr. Zane Thayer is an anthropologist and assistant professor at that little place across the river over there, and someone who has thought a lot about how our environment and prolonged exposure to stress can affect our health. Dr. Thayer.
Thank you. All right, hello everybody. Very excited to be here. Just bought a house recently with my husband down the road on Cliff Street, so new Norwich residents. So hello to all my neighbors I haven't met yet. So I'm an anthropologist. How many people here know what anthropology is? Show of hands. Mixed bag, it's okay. A lot of people don't, it's a little weird. So anthropologists in general, we're interested in people like you. Living people, dead people, not like you. Also our nearest relatives, primates. So we do lots of different things, but something that unites a lot of anthropologists is that we're interested in studying patterns of human variation. So some anthropologists might be interested in studying patterns of cultural variation or differences in language. I'm an anthropologist of the biological bent, meaning that I'm really interested in understanding patterns of human biological variation and how environments, really broadly defined, so things like the ecological environment, so how does living in a really cold place impact your biology? Or how does your social environment, so how does living in things like socially stratified societies versus egalitarian societies, how could that affect patterns of human biology and health? So, as a starting point, a really interesting pattern of variation that I've been interested in trying to understand in my work is what's called the social gradient in health. And this is the observation that both within and between societies, individuals who are socially disadvantaged tend to have poor health outcomes and live for less long than individuals who are more socially advantaged. So what does this look like? Well, I went to look at statistics for our great state of Vermont. So if we think about Vermont, very small geographic space, in many ways a pretty homogeneous state, but depending on which county you live in Vermont, there can be differences in life expectancy of 2 years. Okay? In case you're wondering, Windsor County, we do pretty well. But in other places, this disparity is even greater. So let's go pick on New York City, right? The antithesis of Norwich, Vermont. And in New York City, if you live in Murray Hill, you can expect to live 9 years longer than in East Harlem, just 6 subway stops away. Okay? So we've observed these sorts of patterns for a really long time. And a really interesting question is, what causes these disparities in health? And some people might think that it's something inherent or genetic about these people. So maybe if you have good genes, then you make more money, you're more successful, you have better health. But now we're starting to understand that there's a lot more that goes into shaping this pattern. So one study that's done a lot to inform our understanding of how the social gradient health emerges is what's called the Whitehall study. So this was a study of predominantly white, male, British civil servants who were living in England and who were followed by researchers for like 30 years. And what the researchers were interested in trying to understand was how differences in occupational status affected risk of mortality across time. So the fact that we're working with such a homogeneous group, right? It's all men, they're all white, they're all stably employed, they all have equal access to healthcare, allows us to eliminate a lot of the variables that might confuse or complicate these sorts of studies in other places. What the researchers found was that individuals who had lower occupational status were more likely to die of coronary heart disease in 20 years than those who had a higher occupational status. And what was really interesting was that there was no threshold beyond which this effect ceased to exist. In other words, you might imagine that once you make a certain amount of money, it doesn't matter if there's someone making more money than you, because you've got enough to materially provide for yourself. But in fact, this is a continuous relationship. So somebody who's making more can be expected to live longer than you, even if you're going to live longer than someone else who's lower than you. So this suggested to researchers that this must be more than just material processes that contribute to this relationship. Instead, there might be other pathways, such as psychosocial stress pathways, that could contribute to this. So, as I mentioned, I'm an anthropologist, and another anthropologist who's done a lot of work in this area is a gentleman by the name of Robert Sapolsky. And he does his research not amongst humans, but actually amongst baboons. So Sapolsky, when he was doing his dissertation research back in the 70s, went to Africa, found this baboon troop, and wanted to study how baboons living in the society, how differences in the society structure affected these baboons' health. And so in order to do that, he was interested in looking at their stress hormones. So when you're studying baboon stress hormones, they aren't very willing participants, right? You can't just walk up to them and be like, excuse me, would you please stick out your arms so I can draw your blood? So what Sapolsky did was he devised a method to get their blood, which involved blow darts. Anthropology's the coolest. So basically, he would like sneak up to this troop and blow dart a baboon. It'd get knocked out. He'd take their blood. So why was he taking their blood? Sapolsky was interested in trying to understand how these baboons, which lived in a socially stratified society, how living in that society affected their stress hormones. So within the society, some are higher up and some are lower. If you're lower ranking in the society, it means that other individuals pick on you, they may take the food away, you don't have preferential access to mates, your life kind of sucks. And so what was interesting is that Sapolsky found that individuals who were lower on the social hierarchy had higher stress hormones when he measured it in their blood. And individuals who had higher stress hormones were also more likely to develop poor health. So since humans are also kind of jerks sometimes like baboons, and we also live in socially stratified societies, he wondered if similar processes might be working in humans as well. So what are we talking about when we're talking about stress hormones? What Sapolsky was studying, what I study, what many stress researchers study is a thing called cortisol. Perhaps you guys have heard of cortisol. You know, cortisol causes body fat, like those commercials. So cortisol is a stress hormone. It's released by the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which is a really ancient physiological system. It's shared by all vertebrates. And so in addition to being released in response to stress, so if a predator is chasing you or if you have to give a talk, your cortisol levels just skyrocket. And so it helps you to mobilize energy, makes you think a little faster and clearer on the fly. But of course, there are costs associated with that, right? So in the short term, you get more energy, but that energy has to come from somewhere. So less energy goes into things like reproduction or into long-term immune function. So these are necessary trade-offs that are obviously adaptive in the short term if you're responding to a stressor, but if chronically activated, could potentially have some bad effects. But I do want to make the point that given the fact that cortisol is shared amongst all these different vertebrates, implies that it's a really important thing, right? Evolution isn't going to keep the system around if it's very maladaptive. And so by design, cortisol is a really important metabolic hormone and affects things like reproduction and immune function and energy. So it's not just a bad thing. So anyways, when I'm studying, or many human researchers are studying cortisol, we don't dart our participants because that's unethical. Instead, we measure it looking at different things. So we can measure pieces of hair. So you can take a bit of hair about the size of an eraser and use that to measure cortisol. So you look at about 3 centimeters from the scalp, and that gives you an integrated measure of stress hormone over the last 3 months. We can look at cortisol measured in urine. Typically, people do the first urine in the morning. We can look at cortisol in poo, baby poo, usually. Primatologists use this a lot in field surveys as well. We can also look at it in blood and saliva. And so in most of my research, I've looked at cortisol in saliva just because it's really minimally invasive. So when I'm working with participants, I just have to make them spit in a tube. And that's how I can measure it. Okay, so why is cortisol important? As I mentioned earlier, it's good because it gives us energy, helps us to respond to stressors, but when chronically activated, it can have a lot of maladaptive effects on health. So everything from heart disease, anxiety, depression, all of these outcomes are influenced by high cortisol levels. So, quick survey. How many people here have been stressed today? Felt some stress today? Raise your hand. Keep them up if you felt stress in the last week. How about the last month? All right, everybody, right? Okay. Can I get any volunteers to kindly share something that might have stressed them out? Yeah.
Escape the burning building.
Oh, that's definitely warrants a stress response. Okay. Yeah.
I spent Christmas with my family.
Spent Christmas with your family. All right, good one.
Capstone.
Capstone. That's good. Capstone. Any? Flying. All right, good. The others?
I was up in a ladder pulling snow off a roof.
Ooh, yes. Pulling snow off a roof and a ladder. Yeah.
My daughter, her husband, and her 2-year-old and 4-year-old and dog moved in at Christmas time for 3 weeks.
Say no more. All right, so something we might have gotten a sense for from this little exercise is that humans are really good at getting stressed out. And one of the unique things about humans is that the mere anticipation of stress is enough to activate our stress response. So maybe being on the top of a ladder, having your stress response activated might be good, right? It's making you think clearer so you don't just have a bad move and fall off the ladder. But things like being stressed about your family coming, they haven't done anything yet. And yet, despite the fact that, that nothing acute you have to respond to, this system's being activated and having all these effects. And so, long story short, humans are really good at getting stressed out, and because of this, we're even more likely than other animals to develop these kinds of stress pathologies that we were talking about with the baboons. So, when we study stress, or when I study stress, I like to think about the fact that stress doesn't only happen to us today, right? We've been experiencing stress across our entire life course. And what's interesting is that stress experiences across your life course, including even before you're born, so prenatally, can actually influence your stress physiology and health. And so that's what I've been spending a lot of my career on. I'm really interested in trying to understand how early environments, including the prenatal environment, can influence stress physiology and health across the life course. So in order to investigate this, I've spent most of my time working in New Zealand. I know, a very stressful place. But it is actually a stressful place for some people who live there. So I work in Auckland, which is the largest city in New Zealand. It's about 1.5 million people. So 1 out of 3 Kiwis live in Auckland. It's actually a city with really rapidly increasing economic inequality. So I think I recently read that it's the 3rd most expensive city globally in terms of housing now. So if you look at housing prices relative to income, it's very unaffordable. A lot of this has to do with recent immigration of rich Americans and other people that are coming in and driving up prices. It's also a very diverse city. So I think it's second only to Toronto in terms of diversity. So over 40% of residents in Auckland are actually immigrants. And when you look at immigrants and children of immigrants, it's about 58% of the population. So a really interesting place in which to study things like how inequality and things like discrimination, now that you have lots of people living together, can influence things like health. So for my big study, what I did was I recruited a bunch of pregnant women, which involved sitting in clinics, prenatal clinics, and walking up to every very uncomfortable looking pregnant woman who had no interest in talking to this random American. Hi, hi, my name's Zane. I'm doing a study trying to understand maternal health and well-being in pregnancy, and I'd love to talk to you about your experience. I got a lot of angry stares, but most of them answered my questions, and with some of them I followed up, did interviews in their homes. While in their homes, I asked them all about their lives. I asked them about things that make them happy, things that make them sad, about their jobs, about their relationships, about experiences of discrimination, all sorts of different factors. After the women gave birth to their infants, I followed up with them again and went with them to their infant's 6-week postnatal vaccination visit. And during that time, collected information on the kids' birth outcomes and also collected saliva samples from the moms in pregnancy to look at cortisol. And then after the babies were born, I looked at the infant cortisol stress hormone response to vaccination. And that I did because I didn't want to stress out babies myself. I thought that was a little unethical. So I used the vaccination as a natural stressor that elicited a very strong response across babies. I felt like a really mean person. Just oh, yeah. Anyways, also babies really don't drool on command. You think about babies as drooling all the time, but they don't always drool when you want them to. And when they're sleeping, they really don't drool. And I found the moms were very upset if I wanted to wake their baby up to get them to drool more. Anyways, I digress. So what I was interested in looking at was whether stresses experienced by moms in pregnancy would be associated with maternal stress hormones in pregnancy and offspring stress hormones after birth. And what I found was that women who were poorer and women who experienced more discrimination had higher stress hormones in pregnancy and then gave birth to infants with higher stress reactivity after birth. So this is really interesting, right? Because we've talked about how stress experiences can impact your physiology in a way that can impact your health. But what this research suggests is that experiences by your mom before you're even born can actually prime your stress physiology in a way that may in turn influence your subsequent development for poor health later in life. So this is the research that I've carried on a lot. And I think what I'm really interested in this is trying to understand why might these relationships exist. So why would it make sense for offspring to adjust their stress physiology in response to the environmental experience of their parents? Right? In other words, if we think about it, maternal environmental experience across her life course influences her biology, including the biology of the interuterine environment that the baby's growing and developing in. And so then that in turn shapes the environment in which the baby's growing and developing and their resultant biology. So if you think about it, maternal biology acts as an integrated signal linking environmental experience across her life course with her offspring's biology. So I want to then take a step back and think about something I told you about earlier, which is the fact that this stress physiology system isn't unique to humans. It's found across all vertebrates. So another project we've been interested in working on is trying to understand, well, do we see this sort of prenatal sensitivity to stress only in humans, or do we see it in other animals as well? And so what we've done is we've gone through the literature and tried to find every single study that's ever been published on any animal looking at prenatal stress in relation to offspring stress hormones. And so we found studies in snakes and in chickens and in guinea pigs and monkeys and humans, and we've put them all together and done a meta-analysis to try and see whether there's any sort of universal effects. And what we found is that across this broad range of studies, there's a general trend for prenatal experience of stress to be associated with stress hormones in offspring after birth. Okay, so on the one hand, we have this very conserved evolutionary system across primates or across vertebrates, and then you also see a similar sensitivity to prenatal stress across all these species. But something I think is also really interesting is when we look at the different types of stressors that are found in these studies. So first off, who here has a pet? A lot of people. So what sorts of things stress out your pet? Squirrels. Squirrel. The doctor, okay. So in general, the things that stress out animals are the things that we talked about earlier, actual experiences of stress, right? Things that it makes sense for them to adaptively respond to. So in these studies I was looking at, it had to do a lot with predation pressure, for example. So the number of predators in the environment influences stress hormone levels in the animals, and that predicts variation in stress hormones in the offspring. But in a lot of the human studies, it's things like poverty or discrimination or experience of 9/11, a lot of human-induced sort of stressors. through which it doesn't necessarily always make adaptive sense to modify your stress physiology in order to respond better to those stressors. And so what we have in effect is a stress physiology that's evolved in response to qualitatively different types of stressors that we now respond to in response to these contemporary sorts of exposures. And so we might think about the fact that basically the system we're working with now is a bit maladaptive compared to what it was originally designed to do. So I guess one last thing I want to talk about is just what we do when we're stressed, like how we respond to it. So I don't know about you guys, but when I'm stressed, usually what I want to do is like assume a fetal position and eat lots of like cheddar white Cheez-Its and binge watch Netflix or something to this effect. Or maybe it's just me. But that's probably not the best way to handle stress, right? If we think about what these stress hormones are meant to do, they're meant to give us energy. So really we should be doing something productive with that energy. So things like exercise are actually good because we're using what all those stress hormones are meant to do, as opposed to letting them kind of like, play pinball with our innards. Another thing to think about is being social. So humans, like other primates, are innately social creatures. And so it makes sense that having strong social support, strong social networks, people that you can talk and work things through with would be something that's an adaptive kind of response to stress. So in any case, kind of a random bit of things and facts, but happy to answer any questions you guys have. Thanks. Yep.
If you measure cortisol in an infant at age 6 weeks,
Yes,
and presumably cortisol crosses the placenta,
it does.
how do you know that the cortisol elevation is being produced by the infant and not residual from the mother during the gestation?
Sure, absolutely. So we think that some of the programming effects, if you will, so some of the reason why offspring stress physiology is associated with prenatal stress is because maternal cortisol is crossing the placenta and getting into fetal circulation and affecting the development of stress physiology system in the offspring. So I would say that if we're measuring it in the offspring 6 weeks after birth, we're measuring what's endogenous in the offspring. But I think that that is absolutely influenced initially by how many stress hormones it's being exposed to in utero. That answers your question. Yeah. Yeah, so I don't think that it's necessarily residual maternal cortisol, because cortisol is metabolized, right? You're constantly producing it. But I do think that how much cortisol the offspring is producing is absolutely influenced by how much it was exposed to prenatally.
So you're saying the cortisol residual in the infant's blood has a half-life that's a lot shorter than
Absolutely,
6
absolutely,
weeks.
absolutely. Yep.
Related, what about through breast milk?
Absolutely. So cortisol also is transmitted through breast milk. And so it's very possible. You actually find that there are differences in cortisol levels between breastfed and non-breastfed infants. So when we think about programming of offspring stress physiology, I don't think that it's necessarily limited to the prenatal period. Because if we think about it from an evolutionary perspective, it makes sense that it's kind of all of early life that would be sensitive, right? And we know that environmental experiences in early life, in the first few years of life, have very strong impacts on biology. What's quite interesting is that that period of environmental sensitivity overlaps with a time in the life course where maternal and offspring biology are so connected, first in utero and subsequently through lactation.
But I wasn't stressed until I had to breastfeed them.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. It's a good question. Yep.
So how do you separate the what you're calling pre-programmed response from an infant's response to its current stress?
Yeah, it's very difficult to differentiate, right? So there's different kinds of study designs. So some people, for example, look at cortisol at birth, for example, and try and find associations with prenatal. And we can look at different points in the life course and find associations between prenatal environments and cortisol later on. But if we think about it, normally prenatal and postnatal environments are probably pretty strongly correlated, right? So for the most part, if you're in a crappy situation before birth, you're probably in a crappy situation after birth. So it's very difficult to differentiate in the relative timing of effects and what's most important. So what we need to do that are really large studies where kind of by chance alone, some people's situations are improving or decreasing. And actually the study I'm working with in New Zealand now is a study of 6,800 women. And so in that sample, we have that a little bit. So we're starting to look at those questions, how differences between prenatal environments and environmental experience at 2 years, for example, if that's different in predicting offspring obesity at 5 years, or different outcomes. It's a great question.
Have there been adoption studies that look at that sort of thing?
Yeah, so let's see. So it would be a great design to have an adoption where you have presumably like a bad or good prenatal environment and then switch over postnatal. The only ones I've seen have been studies, for example, from Romanian orphanages, so they're older. So kids who are in Romanian orphanages where they were very deprived, who then get adopted out, and those kids tend to have a lot of problems. But that's not limited to prenatal. So I haven't seen any actually that look at that. It's a good question.
What are you doing with the, excuse me, what are you doing with the information and the findings and how to change things or respond to this?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, I publish in articles. I try and do lots of public outreach talks in New Zealand and here. But I think that the kind of public health message that I try and promote from this specific research I talked about today, as well as others, is that it's really important to support early life environments, right? Prenatal and postnatal, like those are very important years. And when a lot of times we see health disparities in adulthood, and then we target things like health behaviors. Like you just need to be eating better and taking care of yourself, it's your fault, and blaming the individual. And what this kind of research suggests is that actually if we want to reduce health disparities in adulthood, we should start much earlier in the life course. And by improving early life environments, we can actually reduce adverse outcomes in later life. Yeah.
Did you look at, is there a difference between mothers who suffer from chronic stress versus acute stress?
Great question. So that's something that isn't very well differentiated in the literature, I'd say. So a lot of times when we're talking about stressors like poverty, for example, like those are pretty chronic sort of stressors. Other studies will look at significant life events. So they'll say, it'll be a survey where they ask about, did you lose a partner in pregnancy? Did you lose a job? Did somebody go to jail? So that's trying to get kind of at more acute things. The issue is that people who are in crappy situations are more likely to have those things happen also. Right, for the most part. So again, unless you have a very large study where you can kind of differentiate them, it's difficult to. And so I would say that question isn't adequately addressed. From an evolutionary perspective, we might hypothesize that if this is really about mothers trying to signal environmental quality to offspring, that chronic stress should have stronger effects than acute stressors. That would be the hypothesis. Yeah.
I guess I'm wondering about the persistence of cortisol as an evolutionary response to human stress, because so many of the things that humans experience are not helped by the presence of cortisol.
Absolutely.
Necessarily.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm wondering about whether cortisol may eventually be reduced or selected out evolutionarily.
Yeah, I mean, so cortisol still does have adaptive effects for us, and cortisol, in addition to be a stress hormone, is also a really important metabolic hormone. So across the day, there's variation in cortisol. So in the morning, it's really high to kind of help you mobilize energy to get through the day, and then it comes down in the evening. And it's just such a evolutionarily deep system. I can't anticipate that necessarily happening. But there's certainly traits that you could try and maybe make that argument for. Yeah.
Is cortisol, does it reduce inflammation or cause it, or what's the relationship?
Increases inflammation.
Increases.
Yeah.
So, but if you're exercising hard, you're supposed to do that. That's good stress.
Yeah. So you mean exercising?
Well, no, I mean, stress, trees, and all sorts of things get stressed, which makes them stronger in theory. But maybe it isn't true. I don't know. Is there a good stress that, or is it just the coping part? Or, there must be.
Yeah, so I mean,
Some
benefit?
People talk, so in the developmental literature, so talking about studies with kids, people talk about some stress as being positive, right? So everyone's going to experience stress in their lives, and so it's good to be exposed to a little bit of stress for your system to become primed and know how to respond appropriately. Then they differentiate between that and what in the developmental literature what they call toxic stress, which are really high levels of stress combined with a lack of social resources to help you deal with that stress. So if you don't have a strong caregiver or figure, for example, then that can become pathological. So I guess in terms of your point, I think that a little bit of stress, doesn't kill you. It has to do with kind of chronic and persistent stress in combination with inadequate, coping responses.
I know, Dr. Berry, you published on early childhood development, early childhood exposure to traumatic stress and maybe adult onset PTSD.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, how long down the road do you still suffer the effects of exposure to stress?
Yeah.
Does it manifest itself within months, years, 10 years down the road? Can you still be?
Yeah, so I think that a lot of research suggests that early life stress and traumatic experiences can continue to have health effects much later into life. And so the study that was just being referenced was a study, not in New Zealand, but actually native health in the US. And so what we were looking at was whether early life experience to traumas would be associated with the development of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and basically poorer health in adulthood. So once people are the sample was average of 45 years old. And so what we found was that individuals who experienced more early life traumas were more likely to develop PTSD and had poorer health in adulthood, independent of things like health behaviors, so how much alcohol they drank, whether they smoked, independent of income, independent of adult trauma exposures. So really interesting, because a lot of times, again, we think that these disparities in health, we look at these adult indicators, and this suggests that early life environments may really be priming people for this. And with PTSD in particular, PTSD is super interesting. A lot of people are exposed to trauma and not everyone develops PTSD. So an interesting question is, why do some people develop it while others don't?
Why do some people develop?
So the jury's out, but there are some hypotheses that early life trauma experiences may prime things like the stress response system in a way that may make you more susceptible to developing PTSD later in life in response to subsequent stressors. Yeah.
I think there'd be two interesting directions to study this. One would be looking at the elderly population who survived to their 80s and 90s and to see is there some protective mechanism going on in this axis that helps them to survive that long. And another might be looking at twin studies, and especially twins who maybe were separated and grew up in different circumstances. I wondered if anyone had looked at those areas.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with the twin research. There's definitely like a body of twin researchers. It's like a big thing. And in my perusal of the literature, it's not something I've actually run across a lot, probably because there aren't a lot of discordant twins, for better or worse. Your latter point is also a good one in that, so these two studies I've described, one is prenatal and we're following the kids now as their children. The other one is looking at adults and we're asking them about experiences early in life, right? So it's retrospective. And this is really a way to get around the fact that humans live a really long time. And so it's going to take forever to take these kids that were born and follow them into adulthood. And so the way we're kind of cheating around this is by, finding associations between stress and childhood outcomes, and then looking at adults and asking them about earlier life outcomes. So both of these approaches have their limitations, but it's a way to kind of try and cobble together some semblance of truth. But you also mentioned a really interesting point about basically gets down to resilience, right? And I think that's also a really interesting direction to go. So as I mentioned earlier, not everyone who experiences trauma develops PTSD. Not everyone who experiences stress develops stress-related pathology. And so something we're also really interested in trying to understand are the kinds of factors that confer resilience. And in the resilience literature, some people talk about resilience as kind of an individual trait. So it's something that you're born with or something that you learn. Some people talk about resilience as more of a cultural trait or a group level kind of trait. So it's actually a really sticky thing to measure and define, but something that I want to learn a lot more about. I think it's a great point.
Do you have a sense of a difference between intrinsic and external stressors, do they affect our health outcomes differently? I'm thinking like exposure to secondhand smoke or something as
Sure.
a child versus internal emotional stress.
Sure. Yes, there's lots of different, we can define stressors a lot of different ways. They could be everything from kind of mechanical stressors on our body to things like smoking, or what a lot of my research has been is kind of the psychosocial stress. But I think another interesting point related to that is that a lot of people can experience the same stressor and they may evaluate that stressor differently. So actually an interesting example of this was when I was asking people about experiences of discrimination. So I was doing my interviews, I asked someone if they'd experienced discrimination, and some of them shared stories about what they'd experienced. So one woman who was of Chinese descent in Auckland was telling me that the week before she was at a grocery store and she was pushing her cart and came to a stop because there were these two white women talking that were in her way. And she said, excuse me, so she could get by, and they totally ignored her. And so finally she just pushed past them, and they scoffed at her, and she was upset. And so this is what she described to me. So I've told some people that story, and they said, well, that's not necessarily discrimination. Like maybe those women just didn't hear her, or maybe they were having a bad day. But what's interesting is that this is how that woman interpreted in the context of her life in New Zealand, and the fact that there's very xenophobic messages and constantly harassment of Chinese citizens there. And so while two people can have the same objective experience, you can evaluate that experience in different ways. You evaluate that experience in the context of your cultural environment and your prior experiences. And so depending on how you evaluate that experience, though, that may affect your stress response to that experience. And then in addition to that, what resources you have to help you cope with it. So maybe if you're able to talk to people about it afterwards, it won't elicit the same kind of response than if you don't. So it is a pretty complicated kind of thing. When you just measure an objective stressor, it may affect different people in other ways.
Another question?
Yes.
Yep.
So you came this close to addressing this issue about PTSD. Do sufferers have more cancers, more heart disease, more shorter life expectancy, irrespective of confounding variables like alcohol and tobacco and such?
Yeah, so I don't know much about PTSD and cancer per se. I know that there's relationships between PTSD and cardiovascular disease, for example, because that's mostly what I've looked at. But there are definitely physical effects of PTSD. And also, PTSD has physical effects that are unique relative to other anxiety disorders. So we're talking about things like cortisol. PTSD is actually associated with blunted cortisol, so chronically lower cortisol levels. And so the way this is interpreted is basically like the systems become overworked and kind of is broken, and so you don't respond anymore, which is quite interesting. And there's also a lot of neurological effects, so a lot of hippocampal degradation, so it affects your memory and spatial awareness and things like this. So yeah, it's a really interesting disorder.
So does that get treated with like a cortisone or cortisol replacement?
I haven't.
Someone with Addison's disease that has.
Yeah, I haven't heard that. Yeah, I've never heard of that as a treatment, but it is a different kind of stress profile than things like depression, for example, which is associated with higher cortisol levels.
Any other questions? Don't be afraid of the camera. Well, I'm sure Dr. Thayer will stick around for a minute, answer any questions that you want to ask. And I just say how terrific it is to have such access to enthusiastic and knowledgeable researchers. And thank you, Dr. Thayer, for being here. And stick around. The bar is still open. There's plenty of people to meet here. And our next talk is next month in February. And please join us in. Thanks for everybody coming.